Hey, welcome to another episode of Coffee HEMA with me, Jamie McKeever. Today I want to talk about providing swords for tournaments or not, as the case may be, and a few issues to consider as you're doing that. This is particularly forefront in my mind because I have a new rapier which I'll use to kind of illustrate the point. No pun intended. This is common, but you see it quite frequently. Although by far the most common is for people to just have a bring your own sword policy. So for most tournaments, people have to bring their own kit, their protective kit, and they have to bring their own sword, right? So whatever sword you want to do, you got to bring it along. And there'll normally be some rules about that. It'll be like it's got to be between this weight and that weight, or the flex has to be no more than this. Certain brands might be banned because of known issues with them that the organisers are aware of or believe to exist. They may or may not be true. There may be like criteria, things like no pointy shilts is one that we have in Wessex, that kind of stuff, right? So you give a criteria, and then people come along with that, and their swords get checked against whatever that happens to be. Sometimes tournaments aren't great about checking swords. Right? They come up with complex rules and they don't check them, and Wessex is guilty of that to some extent. We do have a kit check, but the head ref will see a sword, and if it looks broadly correct, they'll be fine. They'll say it's fine, and if it's kind of at the borderlines of anything, then they'll ask for it to get measured. But for the most part, we don't measure because that kind of rigorous measuring of a sword's properties to make sure that it kind of corresponds to whatever criteria you've given is itself an organizational challenge. It slows things down because fencers have to take their sword and get it checked, and like you could either have someone doing it before the tournament starts, in which case it is another delay for tournament starting. You could have someone doing it periodically and marking the swords in some way, shape, or form, but then you've got to schedule someone to be sat there, doing that and not staffing something else. So, fundamentally though, this again is the most common approach to doing it. Right? Bring a sword. Bring a sword. If it's deemed acceptable, you can use it. If it's not deemed acceptable, you can't. Right? And for a bunch of reasons, some tournaments decide, don't want to do that nonsense. I'm just going to give everybody the sword that I want them to use. So they buy a bunch of swords to lend out for the purposes of the tournament, and everybody's using the same sword. Now, there are different reasons people give. Some people cite that it's fairer. I'm going to come back to that one because I strongly disagree about that point. But what is undeniable is it does solve some of the logistical issues of people bringing any old sword. And we always have this in Wessex. There's always one or two swords that someone's brought that don't pass kit check, and then you've got to scramble around. They've got to scramble around for a sword to borrow of someone, or sometimes pools are very nice and they kind of joggle the sword, and it's not great, right? And the process of checking swords rigorously, as I mentioned, is a bit of a pain in the ass, right? Either you're not very precious about checking it closely, in which case, you're not really testing it, or you have to put some process in place to make sure that swords that are either suspect or all swords are tested, and that is a lot of hassle, both in the run up to the event and on the day, right? And admin on the day is much worse than admin in the run up to the event, because that's what leads to delays. So those are good reasons to kind of do it. The sword that you purchased is safe as far as you consider, unless it's really stupid and unsafe swords. So everybody's using a safe sword. You don't have to check that. You just give them the sword, they fence with the sword, job done, right? Now, all of those are good reasons. Of course, it costs you money, right? You got to buy the swords, but that's manageable. You put it on the ticket price, or you sell it to a club or whatever, right? Afterwards, you can definitely. It's not necessarily a bank-breaking price to do that. And that's all well and good, but some people then also say that it's fairer to provide swords to everybody. Oh, sorry, one other thing I didn't mention is, of course, international travellers, right? Providing swords is great for them because they can just rock up and they don't have to worry about flying with swords, which is always a pain for oversized luggage. So international travellers, or people coming down from anywhere far, really, the travel to get there is easier because of not having to worry about swords. So that helps too, assuming that it's just the tournament. There's no sparring they've got to worry about bringing their swords for anyway. But the fairness issue, coming back to that people talk about it being fairer, I wholeheartedly disagree with. Because obviously when you've picked, everywhere I've ever seen do it has picked a bunch of swords with identical characteristics. And people say that's fairer because you don't have someone with a short sword versus the long sword, or everybody's got the same reach and it's fine, right? But in reality, that's bollocks. Just to put not too fine a point on it, right? Because people choose swords with different properties for different reasons, right? Sometimes it's because they couldn't afford a better one and they got a cheap one, right? And there are some cases where there are swords that are just better than others, right? Like Oris is an example of it. It is just a really good sword, although it's not. It's not. For instance, it's got issues to it in the sense that it's not a longer sword. It's a 97 centimeter blade, and sometimes fencing people with 8 centimeters longer blades in the tournament restrictions, and that's a reach disadvantage, right? Definitely. But the thing is, for the most part, people pick a sword that suits them, and that could be for a variety of reasons, right? My Aureus, as I say, is not a longer sword. It's a very nimble sword, so it suits the kind of the closer distance stuff that I prefer to fence at, rather than kind of chasing a reach advantage that I don't have against a lot of fencers. So when you take that away, you haven't even the playing field. You've given me a disadvantage, right? My opponent may or may not have the same issue, right? Maybe they prefer a longer sword for a reach advantage. Okay, fine, you've given them a disadvantage too. But what about if my opponent actually likes a sword that happens to match perfectly to the dimensions that you've chosen? There actually what you've done is you've given me a disadvantage, but you've not disadvantaged my opponent. Or maybe it's better than the sword that they've got, and you've advantaged my opponent. Rapier, this is more pronounced for me than everything else, because rapier, especially single rapier, is my kind of least trained weapon. So I really cannot use very long, very heavy rapiers effectively, because essentially I haven't trained the 3 specific forearm muscles that were required to be able to manipulate a heavy rapier well. I have a much lighter, shorter rapier. I think I just fenced some people at the weekend. I had more than 10 centimeter reach disadvantage against many people, and I would tell you flat out, I fenced better against them with my short rapier. It's a bit lighter and I can manipulate it a bit easier than I would have had having a matched rapier to them, right? And some of them actually offered, I've got a spare, do you want to borrow it? And I said, no, I want to use the rapier that suits my style, suits what I'm doing, suits the fact that I've got a hand injury, so I like to have it lighter so I'm not straining the hand a bit more, right? All these kinds of things, either to do with my fencing style or my body, my injuries, my strength, all that kind of stuff, mean that actually matching to somebody else's sword is not fairer, it is disadvantaging me. And in the process of standardizing it for everybody, actually you are doing a random coin toss about who's getting disadvantaged, who's getting advantaged, who's got kind of a neutral position, rather than leveling the playing field. So that's not to say don't do it, right? And I do like the idea, and I'm keen for us to do this at Wessex, to have kind of defined loaner swords that are available for lending if someone's sword doesn't pass kit check, or if an international traveller is coming and they can't travel with swords, they don't want to travel with swords, you can say, it's fine, we've got one of these swords you can borrow and you can use that one for the course of the tournament. That's a great idea if you can afford it and if you can do it in terms of storage and logistics, all that kind of stuff. And I will admit that all of the logistical and safety reasons for why you might want to provide swords are perfectly valid and good reasons, and you might consider them to be to take priority over the kind of the fairness aspects. But if you think you are making it fairer by providing swords, you are just flat wrong. That should not be something that you use as a pro point for providing swords. That's definitely in the negative column for providing swords. So by all means do it if you want to. Just understand the consequences of your decision and make sure that you balance them correctly, rather than thinking that you're helping people by providing them swords from a fairness perspective. As I say, you're not. Thanks for watching.